This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and a generous investment by Julianne Wrigley.
Now, what happens next is really strange. We see an explosion that has led us from that moment over the last 10,000 years to the present situation. But interestingly, the climate stays stable for that whole period. So the climate is out as a driver, and that is an important part of my earlier argument about the role of climate in all of this. Now, strangely enough, this graph you need to read from right to left. It's the only one, but that's the way these people think about these things. Nothing I can do about it. So change accelerates when the Holocene climate is stable. And why is that? Well, I think because a completely new way of life emerges. And some of the outside phenomena are this. People start investing in the environment. They've never done that before. They've harvested things that presented themselves to them and that they could use. But now agriculture, cultivation, means that you have to clear off a bunch of forest. You have to take all those horrible stubs out because these trees are huge because they've never been attacked. You then need to sort of plow the earth, seed things, and you need to wait until they come back up again. And with stock raising, it's even more so because you need several years for any herd to be sufficient so that you can actually live off it. So we see lots of new technologies. We see pottery, we see basketry. We see larger groups of people living together, and that's a very important part of this. Because with the limits of individual cognitive capacity, once you get more challenging situations, you're bringing together more people to think about them and can try and come up with a solution. Once you've found that solution and implemented it, that creates unintended consequences that pushes you to bring even more people together. So you get a feedback loop that is between innovation and invention, the environment, and then more and more people. So people start settling down. They start living in one place. They have villages like you see up there. They start making all kinds of very complex three-dimensional objects in the opposite way from how it happened before. Because before, they took a big piece of stone and hacked things off so that it became smaller. Now they start with an individual fiber or an individual reed and then first make it into a longer piece of string. Then they weave it together into something two-dimensional. And finally, they sew it together to make a garment, which is a three-dimensional object. So the cognition there also changes fundamentally. And that leads, in the case of pottery, to the fact that suddenly people are able to deal with a completely different topology. And in this particular case, it is the first time that you have a solid around a void. So far, we had either solids or voids, and we begin to get that very strange combination, which leads to huts as well as pots, as well as baskets and other things. So the question is, the old system, groups running around, could have continued. Why didn't it? Because the climate would have allowed that without any further trouble. Okay. And this is an important slide which I already sort of anticipated. This is a slide in which I argue that what is happening is a feedback loop in our own minds initially, in which problem solving structures our knowledge. That then increases our information processing capacity. That in itself allows the acquisition of new data, the observation of new problems, and creates new knowledge. But at the collective level, this plays out even more strongly. Because of the individual limits, in the interaction between ourselves and the environment, we create all these unintended consequences that are in many ways challenges. And so those become bigger and bigger because of the infinite dimensionality of the world around us as compared to the very limited dimensionality of what we can cognize. And so the end result is that the only way to do that is bring more and more people together, deliberate, and so on. So what is the constraint then also shifts from the information processing in an individual to actually the group's information processing. And there a new element comes in, and that is the role of communication. And we'll get back to that in a moment. So the first step of all of this long evolution, because from now we're actually outlining the drivers of what got us to the present is this. Simple pots, something like Stonehenge, a plow, which is here reconstructed, but I've actually seen the same ones used in Syria in 1974. And the three-dimensionality of statues is not emerging for new, but is becoming more and more widespread. So how did that change the dynamic? A fundamental aspect of that is that now we intervene in nature. Because we intervene, we have unintended consequences. And because we have unintended consequences, the risks that we are exposed to as a society start shifting. And they start, because we take out all the short-term risks that we observe and that we then do something about, they shift towards the longer-term unknown risks. So the tendency then becomes, okay, how can we control that? So we start simplifying the environment, for example. Fields, cultivation fields, are simplified bits of the environment because we've killed off most of the other plants that were there. We differentiate in space, certain activities here, other activities there. So in a sense, the emphasis then is no longer one of feeding yourself, that remains a problem, but we're more and more confronted with larger problems that need to be solved, and that focuses us on collaboration, communication, and so on, and group growth. But the result of that is, of course, and I mentioned that before, that suddenly the cost is growing of our social complexity and the fact that we need to deal with all the conflicts that that entails. And anybody working in a university knows how bad they are. So what happens then is that more and more people start living together. And so we see the first cities. For a long time, about cities, the argument was that they were more efficient from an energy perspective. If you think about it, the more people you bring together, the further you have to go to get the food to feed them. So that's not necessarily so easy an equation. And so my argument is that what brings cities together is the need to process more and more information together and to shorten the communication links, and in particular, the time it takes to find exactly the right person that you need to solve a particular problem. So what then happens is that you get a very interesting feedback loop between organization happening at the core of society and being used to harness from a wider and wider area the actual energy and matter that are needed to feed the individuals that constitute the society. That means that in the core of that society, and that is in the towns, we need to keep innovating because we need to keep interesting people to be part of this. If they all know what's going on, then they can go their own way, and we see many instances of that. So innovation drives urbanization, and as Jose Lobo knows, who is here, one of the things that you can demonstrate is that it is still the case for our modern cities. But I'll leave him to explain that someday. Now, this is an old illustration, but it basically says, okay, you have a group of people, they start interacting. The ones at the core will get more information than the ones in the periphery. And so as they get more information, they also develop more knowledge and they can process even more information. So there is a driver that makes the core, and that's here represented by the third dimension, move up and then move out. But at a certain point, energy becomes a constraint that can't be lifted. Or something else happens, big plague or something like that. And at that moment, of course, that sort of what I call a dissipative flow structure, which is this sucking in of energy and putting out of information, stops. And that is when the whole thing collapses.
This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability for educational and non-commercial use only.